Parliament, this evening's speaker, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. For the 15th time now, your committee in Bradford commemorates the Captive Nations Week. It reflects with sadness that our respective countries in Eastern Europe are still in the bondage of the Russian communists and imperialists. It also reflects the determination of this committee and of the 6 East European communities residing here in Bradford. Why do we then commemorate the Captive Nations Week every year for all those past years? For this, there are basically 3 reasons. Firstly, we see ourselves as ambassadors for our countries and our peoples. More significantly, since they are denied their own voice, it is our duty to speak on their behalf. Secondly, our voice and expression here in the free world and the knowledge that they are not forgotten give them strength to endure oppression, humiliation and hardship. Thirdly, and perhaps most important of all, we offer the free world a way to combat the expansion of the communist Red Plague without the recourse to the arsenal of deadly weapons that would spell destruction for the whole of the mankind. For we believe that the communist colossus can be destroyed from within. And indeed, the support to the freedom-striving Ukrainians, Balts, Belarusians, Georgians, Afghanistans, Poles, Czechoslovaks, and Hungarians, and many others, will ensure the collapse of the Russian Empire without a world conflict involving nuclear holocaust. For these reasons, the Captive Nations Week will go on being commemorated in Bradford until such time when the purpose of it is fulfilled. Thank you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you and ask to speak to us tonight the chairman of the British chapter of the European Freedom Council, Councillor Reg Davis. Yes,
Chairman, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your confidence in me and inviting me to speak to you tonight. I feel very honoured and very privileged to do so. Yesterday, July 21st, 1984, I celebrated the birth of my 3rd child. She was born free. How many people who are born free and enjoy freedom really understand what freedom is and what value they should place on it? I think very few. Freedom is something that is bestowed upon the lucky ones in this world, and we tend to take it for granted that we have this freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom to do what we like to do within the laws of the land. But very often we don't really appreciate freedom. the people who appreciate freedom are the people who have had their freedom taken away, forcibly, by somebody else, illegally. These are people who understand what freedom is, because they are people whom freedom is denied. Now, to be born free, my little daughter's dad is now addressing the Six Nations who are subjugated under the Russian tyranny. I don't want her to be seeing me off and waving me goodbye in another 15 years when I come to address Captive Nations Week or subjugated nations. I don't want this to happen. Before that time, long before that time, I want and I expect Eastern Europe to enjoy the same sort of freedom that I enjoy today and that my daughter will enjoy having been born yesterday. It occurs to me that if you look at the subjugated nations, it reminds me when I go to a zoo where there are animals in cages. How do we expect those animals to behave when they are forcibly herded together, locked up, and their freedom is denied? They look the same. A lion is a lion is a lion. But isn't it so nice to see a lion roaming about freely in the African plains rather than to see the same lion pacing around in a cage? Same lion, looks exactly the same. And to me, it is exactly what is happening to your nations in Eastern Europe. You've been put in a cage by the Russians, and they won't let you out. My contention, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, is that we must make Russia free of the subjugated nations. And we must make them do it very quickly. It occurs to me also that millions of people have died throughout the world, throughout history, fighting for freedom. And yet here we are, concluding Captive Nations Week, when we have to admit that we still have many, many nations in Eastern Europe held captive. What did the people die for? They died for our freedom. Had they not have believed this, they would hardly have fought so gallantly in the past. What a disappointment for them that we still have to admit that people are still captive and people are still held against their wishes and against their will under the dictatorship of communism in Eastern Europe. We need to ask ourselves, Mr. Chairman, how do we become free? One simple answer would be to go and shoot the Politburo, to go and slaughter a few Russians, or many Russians, and obtain freedom in that way. That will obtain freedom. But if we are to be realists, and I'm sure we are, we must understand that that would not work. So we need to look at other ways of becoming free. Let us imagine, Mr. Chairman, if we had 6 or even 16 solidarity movements. If you reflect on the problems that this nation has with the miners' strike, the fact that police leave is being cancelled, that overtime is being worked to contain the striking pickets to allow workers who want to work to go to work. It puts a very heavy strain on the government and the police. Can you imagine what would happen, even in this country, if you multiplied the miners' strike by 10? You would have the most serious problems that the nation would find very, very difficult to overcome and contain. So I say to you, isn't it then logical that if we had 6 or 10 or more of those sort of movements within the Russian Empire, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to contain it? And these are the ways, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, that I want you to think about, that we should explore in order to force Russia to free off the subjugated nations. We need, Mr. Chairman, to increase massively and quickly our ability to spread the news throughout this nation and throughout any other nation about exactly what is happening in Eastern Europe. Because the fact of life is that people do not know and they do not understand what is happening. It is up to us, the people who do know, to make sure that people everywhere understand fully what is happening in Eastern Europe. If you go and visit Russia, as we all know, they will take you to where they want you to go to. They will let you see what they want you to see. They will hide what they don't want you to see. And they will hide it from everybody, and they do. Their propaganda machine works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We, I believe, are a little sleepy when it comes to propaganda, because we do a little bit here and a little bit there, and we don't really get the message across. I am often criticised by people who can loosely be described as wets for my rhetoric when I talk about Russia. I make no apologies, Mr. Chairman, for my feelings about Russia, and you'll be hearing more of that as we go on. To me, it is one of my greatest ambitions is to tell as many people as often as I can just exactly what Russia stands for and what Russia is and what it's doing to the subjugated nations of Eastern Europe. We need, Mr. Chairman, to demonstrate more openly, more positively, and we need to make people realise what exactly is the state of affairs. Because at the moment, the Russians are clearly winning the propaganda war. They have convinced many people in this country and many other Western countries that they are quite normal and they live normal, decent, honest lives. That, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is absolutely untrue. Their aim is world domination, and they want to spread their evil communism throughout the world. I, Mr. Chairman, would say to you and your people, we have to resist with every power that we can the spread of communism. When we look around in this country, we see communism has infiltrated trade unions. I have a copy of this morning's Sunday Express, and I will read to you a comment by Dr. David Owen. But suddenly, caution was thrown to the winds, and for the first time in its history, the leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party had openly and unashamedly embraced the industrial strategy of the Communist Party and the ragbag of Marxist revolutionaries on the far left of British politics. That is today's newspaper. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is happening. It has happened. The very thing that we thought would never happen. It could never happen to us. We could never go communist. It is happening. It has happened. What have we done about it? And I appeal to everybody, particularly one of our honoured guests is an MP, particularly MPs, to go into the House of Commons and demonstrate that we are being taken over slowly but surely by communists. Yet we seem quite relaxed about it. It'll be too late when somebody is standing somewhere and preaching about captive nations, including Britain. But it's happening. You can see it everywhere you go. The communists are working overtime. They're ahead of the game. They're up early in the morning. And they don't lose any opportunity to get their message across. Let us learn, if we learn anything at all from these people, let us learn the art of propaganda from them. And let us counter their propaganda with our propaganda. Let us meet force for force, words for words, and deed for deed. And let us meet it at every turn. Don't let's fall asleep. Don't let's leave things till tomorrow, because you need to do it today. We look, Mr. Chairman, at their latest atrocity, their latest acquisition. We look at the country, Afghanistan. And we think about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan who are fighting this bitter war with the communists, with Russia. But what are we doing? Not a lot. The government doesn't appear to be doing a lot. The United States doesn't appear to be doing a lot. Nobody appears to be doing anything at all to help the Mujahideen fight the evils of communism. But they're fighting the evils of communism, and they need some help. And I urge every one of you to do all you can to help the Mujahideen fight communism. Because if Russia can be defeated, even on a battlefront, it will severely deter that nation from possibly going into other countries to probably face the same fate. So we need to take every opportunity to use every ounce of strength and every resource we have available to help the Mujahideen fight the evils of communism. They have instinct. They know what it will be like. They know that when Russia finally takes over, God forbid, we'll start to see slave camps, the institutions where people are locked up because they dare to speak out against the state. And they feel that they must address the balance, and so must we. How many times do we, for instance, communicate directly with the subjugated nations? How often do we inspire them? How often do we say to them, look, over here in England, we can't probably do a lot in terms of might or military power, but at least we can say to them, we have organizations here who are with you, who are praying for you, who are thinking of you, and we need to encourage the peoples of the subjugated nations to struggle on, because the people who died before them would have died to no avail unless the battle can be won. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, the battle can be won. We can, in fact, persuade Russia to free off the subjugation nations. And I believe, as you referred to earlier, Mr. Chairman, that one of the answers would be a coordinated effort by all of the subjugated nations to create such a problem for Russia that it could not overcome that problem. And I believe that it's people in places like this who can go over there or send messages across there to coordinate the activities that need to happen. Because if we simply do nothing, then communism will roll forward and it will envelop every liberty and every nation on earth. There is no doubt about that at all. We hear of Russification of the subjugated nations. They aren't content merely to enslave several nations. They want to Russify them. They want them to speak the Russian language. They want them to lose their identity. They want them to lose their culture. They want them to forget who they are and become Russians. This must be resisted at every turn. The subjugated nation should not lose their identity. They should not bow to Russification. They should continue to feel independent, because independent must come. We need, Mr. Chairman, to look at the Russian army. The Russian military might is, as we all know, almost on a par with that of the USA. But the Russian army, the people who serve Russia in its armed forces, let us bear in mind and not forget, are people from the subjugated nations. We recently had to defect to Britain from Afghanistan. And again, this is Russia's Achilles heel. Because if we can get the message through to people in the Russian army to resist, to resent, and to do everything they can to persuade their masters and their captors that they're pursuing the wrong course, then this again is another way of persuading Russia to stop doing what it's doing. We need to think, Mr. Chairman, of all the families that are left behind in Eastern Europe. It's the way Russia works. They dare not allow anybody to leave Eastern Europe unless they have a very, very sizable asset to seize if they misbehave. And the most sizable asset, of course, is a man's family. And in 1984, we have to stand here and say that we have people, millions and millions of people in several countries in Eastern Europe, not allowed to travel abroad in case they may say something wrong about the Russian state. The evils of Russia, Mr. Chairman, need to be at the forefront of everybody's mind. We have domestic problems. Our domestic problems are merely insignificant compared to the problems that face the captive nations in Eastern Europe, where whole nations are deliberately held captive against their will. It makes our little problems like the pound sterling or whatever you'd like to mention, the exchange markets, the stock market, they aren't important. What is important is that we are free. We have our freedom. We don't value that freedom, but we have it. I don't even know whether we have a right to it, but we certainly have it, and we enjoy it, but we don't value it. What we need to do is to take stock of what we have, take stock of what we were born with and what we inherited, and say to ourselves, this is what we have. And this should then enable us to fight off the evils of communism, the evils that Russia spreads around this world at every opportunity. And we need to constantly remind ourselves of those evils and to preach about those evils as often as we possibly can. As you know, Mr. Chairman, in 1932-33, 7 million people in Ukraine were deliberately starved to death to satisfy the Russian leadership and to persuade the Ukraine to go into collective farming. 7 million people. If you asked anybody over the age of 20 in this country who Adolf Hitler was, they would be able to tell you. Adolf Hitler led the German army and was responsible for the slaughter of 6 million Jews. Ask them the same question about what happened in Ukraine in 1932-33, and they wouldn't be able to tell you, because they don't know. Isn't this an absolutely monumental propaganda trick that they managed to keep quiet? The fact that 7 million people starved. This is Russia. This is what this country is capable of doing. It did it in the past, it's doing it now, and it will go on doing it until people say enough is enough, and we begin to roll back the evils of communism. And roll back we must, Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen. And we will not do that if we stand passively and allow things to go on. 20 years ago, you would not have read anything anywhere near what has been reported in this morning's paper. They would have said it cannot happen. This is England. It cannot happen to us here. And yet 20 years on, it is happening. And the reason is because too many of us are too content to be nice to the Russians. We don't have to be nice to a nation of people or a nation or a government who deliberately go out and slaughter people, who captivate nations and go on spreading evil throughout the world. We do not and we should not be nice to such people. The time for niceness is over. The time for concerted action is here. Mr. Chairman, I bow to those 6 nations. I feel for those 6 nations. And Mr. Chairman, I hope that I do not have to come back on many more occasions and address captive nations at the end of a Captive Nations Week. I would much rather come to you and celebrate the first Freedom Week. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I am, on behalf of all of us, grateful to our Speaker, Councillor Reg Davis, for a very well-appraised insight in the current problem of communism. And I hope that what he told us can be spread and can be told to those people who need to know and understand this problem. We may one day celebrate and meet in Eastern Europe. I hope we do. Today with us we have a Member of Parliament, Mr. Jeff Lowler, and I would like Mr. Lowler to say us a few words. Please.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited here again. Last year when I came to this event, it was, in fact, I think one of the first events that I came to as the newly elected Member of Parliament for Bradford North. And on that occasion, I thought it highly relevant and appropriate to remind